Well, welcome back. We are midway through this series called Gold, Goats, and Justice, and our hope during your growth group time is that together you will take some time to look at these stories of Jesus, and by doing so, be able to encounter Jesus in a deep and meaningful way. So if you haven't taken the time to read through and discuss today's story, please pause this video, take some time, and do that with your group. Now, forgiveness, it's something that humans have struggled with forever. And it was something that Jesus' disciples struggled to understand as well. In fact, Peter had a question that many of us ask. And in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21, Peter comes up to Jesus and he asks his question. He says, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" And Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Now, some historical context makes this a bit more interesting. You see, Peter probably thought that by starting off with forgiving 7 times, he would seem especially generous and forgiving, because the common teaching from rabbis of that time was that you were to forgive people 3 times. But after that, you had the right to hold their transgressions against them. Pretty much a 3 strikes and you're out kind of rule. So when Peter says, "How often should I forgive my brother? As many as 7 times, he's probably thinking to himself, I will seem especially generous if I ask the question this way. But Jesus responds with an even more radical statement. He says, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Or if you're using a different translation, 7 times 70 times. Jesus doesn't literally mean only 77 times or 7 times 70 times. He's using the repetition of 7s to mean a countless number of times. You keep forgiving. It's not something that we want to limit how much of we do. Forgiveness, it's a life-changing, grace-giving, God-glorifying practice that we should be willing to do over and over and over again. And to help his listeners understand this idea, Jesus tells this story. He says, starting in verse 23, "Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle his accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment was to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him of the debt." So this particular servant, he's called in and he owes a sum of money that is unfathomable. Jesus says the debt was 10,000 talents, and a lot of people have tried to calculate how much money that would have been. That's honestly hard to do. Was Jesus talking about a Syrian talent or an Attic talent? I don't know, but a reasonable guess to how much 10,000 talents was worth is that 1 talent was about 6,000 denarii. And remember, a denarii was about 1 day's worth of wages. So for a day laborer to pay off a 1 talent debt would require 6,000 days worth of earnings. That would mean that it would take an average laborer in Jesus' time about 165,000 years to pay off the debt that the servant owed. The point Jesus is trying to make is clear. This was a debt that the man had no possible way to pay off. So the king, wanting to recount as much of his loss as possible, decides that he'll sell the man, the man's wife, the man's children, and all of the man's possessions. Now this man begs and pleads and he says, "Have patience, I will pay you everything I owe," which we know isn't true because people just can't come up with sums of money that large. But out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave the debt. Let's pause here and notice 2 things. The first is just how costly forgiveness is. This king is taking a total loss on what's owed to him. It's not like he magically found 10,000 talents when he decided to forgive the servant. No, instead, he is accepting the fact that he is not going to get any repayment for the wrong committed against him. This is one of the key elements of forgiveness. The person who forgives always bears the cost of the wrong done to them. If you are choosing to forgive someone, you are saying, I am recognizing that I've been wronged, but I am choosing to bear the cost myself rather than demand that you make it right. Secondly, notice how this story portrays the relationship between humans and God. We all, over the course of our lives, have acted in ways that ignored God. We cause harm to His creation, we cause harm to other humans, we've lived lives that in many ways have been wrong or offensive to God. But instead of demanding that we make things right, through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, God has bore the cost of our wrongdoing so that we can be forgiven. We, in this story, are supposed to see ourselves as people who have been forgiven an unfathomable debt, a debt that we would never be able to pay off. But Jesus goes one step farther. He doesn't just want to illustrate how God acts towards us, He wants us to see how God's forgiveness should change our attitude toward others. Check out what Jesus says next. He says, "But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell on his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay off the debt. When other servants had seen what had happened, they were outraged. They went and told their master everything that had happened." What a scene! This servant, who had been forgiven so much, refused to forgive someone who owed him what would end up being an insignificant amount. In fact, he sends the man who owes him money to debtor's prison, which, by the way, debtor's prison is terrible. In it, a debtor would have to undergo mistreatment, even torture, as incentive for the family to figure out how to drum up the money that was owed. Basically, the faster you pay up, the sooner your loved one will stop suffering. It was incredibly brutal. Well, the king heard of how this forgiven servant was treating those who owed him, and this is what he did. Verse 32 says, "Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all of the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Here's the implication. Recipients of the King's forgiveness are supposed to in turn be forgiving. When we recognize the immensity of God's forgiveness toward us and how it utterly changes our lives, we are changed to want to bless others with forgiveness. In fact, not only are those who receive forgiveness meant to forgive others, but a willingness to forgive others is meant to be one of the signposts for our inclusion in God's people. Remember how Jesus started the story? He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like." And by saying that, he's telling a story that's supposed to illustrate to us what the king of this kingdom is like and what the citizens of this kingdom are supposed to be like as well. And this unforgiving servant is supposed to represent those who miss the point. Not only is our God unimaginably merciful in forgiveness towards us, but those who are truly His people, those who are recipients of His forgiveness, will in turn be people who strive to forgive. As we finish our time together, let me give you 2 quick points of application. First, sometimes it's important for us to reflect upon the depth and magnitude of God's forgiveness. Remembering the depth of God's forgiveness can help us be more forgiving towards others. Secondly, it's important to recognize that forgiveness is not a one-time thing. It's something that we do over and over and over. Peter said, "Should I forgive 7 times?" And Jesus said, "No, 7 times 70, which is important because to forgive someone is to choose every day that you're not going to demand repayment for the wrongs they've committed. This is especially true when it comes to forgiving people with whom we're close. If your spouse hurts you, you forgive every day. Your forgiveness doesn't magically mean that you forget what they did to you. No, it means waking up every day and making the decision that you're not going to bring what they've done back up. You're not going to throw it back in their face next time you have a fight. You're not going to sigh and moan and make their life miserable because you're angry. You are going to make a conscious decision to absorb the costs of their wrongdoing and move on. And that's an everyday decision that you have to make. We forgive because He's forgiven us. And forgiveness, it's one of the marks of God's people. I hope you have a good discussion about what forgiveness is and isn't in your group, and we will see you next week.